Good afternoon. You know me. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek. I'm a Thomas Jefferson scholar, author of 28 books and hundreds of essays on Thomas Jefferson, formal and informal. And I want to welcome you to another episode of The Real Thomas Jefferson. And the aim of the show, as you know by now, is to um, disclose the real Thomas Jefferson from the various sorts of narratives you get about Jefferson being a racist and a hypocrite, and these narratives having nothing positive to say about Thomas Jefferson. So the idea is to go through works of Jefferson, writings of Jefferson, and the accounts of other people, and tease out an account of who Jefferson really was and what his legacy really means for us today. No small beer, as it were. Okay, today I want to talk about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson again. It's important to go over this every once in a while because uh, the received view is that Jefferson did have children uh, with Sally Hemings, and that view is not substantiable when you review the evidence carefully. So the title of this talk is going to be The Twin Towers, Fear and Propaganda in Shaping the False Narrative of Thomas Jefferson's Life and Legacy. Now, for 25 years, the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation, at least it was called that early on, has been pushing the story, since 2000, pushing the story that Jefferson's involvement with slave Sally Hemings. In the year 2000, they concluded an investigative committee and came to the conclusion that Thomas Jefferson was the father of Sally Hemings' last child, and likely the father of, that was in 1808, and likely the father of all of Sally Hemings' children. And strangely enough, in 2018, they come up with a different story that Jefferson was, in fact, the father of all of Sally Hemings' children. That blew me away, merely because there was no additional evidence upon which they're basing their conclusion. And yet they came up with this monstrously large assertion. Leslie Green Bowman, the president at the time, Jefferson is in fact the father of all the kids. All the children. We're going to remove all the qualifiers. There's no need to discuss the issue as if they've ever discussed it in the past 20 years. They haven't, right? But it gave them a pretext for not engaging with any of the scholarship, even though there's not a lot against Jefferson's paternity with Sally Hemings. Now, the in 1998, we had the DNA study, and then we had an argument years later by Fraser Neiman, this statistical argument, Bayesian argument that presumably showed that there's 99% chance of Jefferson being the father of all the children. Then we have Madison Hemings' 1873 testimony adopted by Fawn Brodie in her book, and then later taken as the base for Annette Gordon Reed's very inventive and creative account of Jefferson's involvement with Sally Hemings. So we have biological evidence, mathematical, statistical evidence, and historical testimony, all of which ineluctably, right, converge on the conclusion that Jefferson could only be the father of the children. Now, the ineluctability is mere window dressing. There is no ineluctability. The biological evidence shows only that Eston Hemings had the Jefferson Y chromosome, which implicates Thomas Jefferson, his brother, is one of his brother's male children, or any male line Jefferson who could have had access to Sally Hemings at the time, wherever she was. She was more than likely at Monticello. We don't know that. So the biological evidence doesn't show anything convincingly. The Bayesian argument, it's too weak, it's bogus, and it's misleading. And it's, the thing about the argument that Neiman gives is if whatever data you put in or omit from the equation is going to give you the certain conclusion that you're looking for. So that, I've talked about that before, it's not worth revisiting. And the historical data is based on Madison Hemings' 1873 testimony. I've shown in other episodes is certainly wanting. There is prevarication likely going on in many cases. And it was certainly probably not even written by by Hemings, by Madison Hemings, but by Samuel Wetmore, the editor of the newspaper that published the essay. So you can't just take, three different strands of evidence, three different types of arguments, put them all together, each of them being inconsequential, and take three inconsequential arguments, group them together somehow, and come up with a consequential or a cogent argument. That doesn't work in reasoning, right? If that were the case, then we could take any claim whatsoever, right, and show that it's just as good as it's contradictory. We could say that Jefferson was 6 feet tall, and come up with numerous arguments for that to show, and then we can come up with an argument for Jefferson not being 6 feet tall, and come up with numerous inconsequential arguments for that. And so anything goes. Jeff, sit down. Okay. Now, what I argue is that there is enormity in what, and enormity doesn't mean largeness, it means something morally flawed. There's enormity in what Monticello's been doing for 25 years, right? That enormity is, in my estimation, unpardonable, right? It began with Dan Jordan, who was the president during Peter Onuf's. He was the Thomas Jefferson Foundation scholar at University of Virginia. Peter Onuf led everyone down this descent, this decline, where, he only looked at Jefferson through the eyes of Jefferson's avowed racism and his bigotry and so forth. And things got really nasty as soon as Peter Onuf got hold of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation a professorship at UVA. Dan Jordan was the president of the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation at the time, and he partnered with Onuf in a book that was drawn from a conference on Thomas Jefferson called Jeffersonian Legacies. And they didn't allow any of the great Jefferson scholars to attend the conference, and they were just looking for wild ideas for people somewhat unfamiliar with Jefferson and to discuss his legacy. And they came up with some really zany conclusions, and all that was thought to be a feather in Onuf's cap, the fact that we're coming up with some wild ideas and crazy conclusions and so forth. But Jordan, started all this. Jordan passed away recently. Right. And then after that, we've had Leslie Green Bowman, who brokered this whole notion in 2018 that Jefferson definitely was the father. Right. And now we have Jane Kaminsky, who is the new president. And with her presidency, Gordon Reed resigned from the board. I have no idea where Kaminsky is going to go with all this. But since she's taken office, I think in January of this year, we have a year of her presidency, and the same garbage about Jefferson's paternity of Sally Hemings' children is still up on the webpage, the same arguments. There's been no attempt to rethink any of this, and that she needs to be held responsible for that. In 1 year's time, she's done nothing to even open the door for open discussion of the possibility that Jefferson was not the father of any of Sally Hemings' children. I think that's clearly the case, right? Now, the damage, I argue, will take decades to repair because people prefer scandalous gossip to truth, right? And if the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, as it's so-called now, if they ever turn to valuing veridicality again, right, in historiographical research, it's going to take decades to change the narrative. People want to believe it's true. Right. Now, I have written a book, 2 books actually, on Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, one of which is a condemnation of the uncogency, the weakness of the arguments for Jefferson's paternity of Sally Hemings' kids. It's called Framing a Legend, Exposing the Distorted History of Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings. That was published in 2013. That made little dent in the historical scholarship and the historical landscape on Jefferson's paternity. I suspect it's because it's a Coke or Pepsi thing here. if you like Pepsi in preference to Coke, if I give you a taste test, a blind taste test, and you actually tell me you like Coke better than Pepsi, you're still going to go on drinking Pepsi. It's the same way people are with their beers. They're loyal to the type of beer they drink, regardless of the fact whether it's shown that it's less tasty than another beer or ale. So, so why has my book and a few other books that have been written against Jefferson's paternity, books that invite skepticism, books that invite us to not revise, but rethink the issue of his paternity and go to it again and invite us to discuss it openly, to get together with the pro-paternity people, take the anti-paternity people, and see if we can make some headway, at least settle on a healthy skepticism until such time as we can resolve the issue. Of course, one of the big arguments for me is that there's more DNA research that can be done with descendants of Sally Hemings' children, and they're out there. And we could settle a lot of this by doing that research. We have different DNA methods that give us valuable information, but there's no hurry, there's no haste on the part of anybody at Monticello to try to clear this up. It's just called the fact. So why has my book had so little impact if it looks at the issue logically? I have another book that came out not long ago. Did Jefferson really father any of Sally Hemings' black children? That has made very little impact as well. Several reasons. One is that people don't look at the issue rationally, they look at it emotionally. I think that's characteristic of the younger generation today. They're emotional, right? Perhaps this is part and parcel of the COVID, but I think it's something that happened prior to COVID. People don't want to think rationally. They don't want to think anymore. They invest themselves in conclusions based on their emotions, not upon their ratiocinative capacities. A second problem is that Monticello's been pushing this pro-paternity narrative for 25 years. When I visited Monticello a couple of years ago with my friend Dave Dietrich, I got into it with a tour guide who was talking about Sally Hemings, and I said something, that this was false, and everybody got up in arms and sort of jumped on me. That what does this guy know? And he has said to me, "Have you ever read the commission report, the report of the 2000 panel that was put together at Monticello?" He said, "If you read that, you'd know better." And I said, "I've not only read it, I've destroyed it." It doesn't matter. Everybody was sort of up in arms. And the idea is, and I understand it, is that the people at Monticello are pushing the story, and the people that are getting a tour are going to say, why would they lie? They're in the very building that Thomas Jefferson in which Thomas Jefferson lives. Why are they going to lie about this? If anybody's going to lie, it's going to be the stranger that's shouting at them, right? It's this stranger, Colonel Hollichak, that is prevaricating. I think at some point, if we ever get back to a veridical way of looking at history, people are going to look at this age of scholarship that maybe started in the late 60s with the civil rights movement all the way to the present, and perhaps go beyond the present. They're going to look at it as a sort of dark age, not only for Jefferson scholars, but for scholars of American figures. The issue is so much entrenched in looking at the racism of anybody who owned slaves. Strangely enough, black people too owned slaves. They were white slaves. That's never discussed. You can't discuss that. Anyways, I think when you look at the issue carefully, the best you can say is that it's not impossible that Jefferson was the father. That, however, is such a weak claim. If I say it's not impossible, that really says little, right? And does much too little to establish even the probability of Jefferson's paternity. And that's what we want. But people at Monticello have gone beyond that. They said it's a fact. Now, that's always just astonished me to say it's factual. And yet on their webpage, they give 10 arguments for Jefferson's paternity. You don't argue for facts. If I tell you it's snowing outside, what you do is you peep outside, and if it's snowing outside and where I'm at in Flint at my residence, they say it's snowing outside at my residence in Flint. I verify that by looking outside. I don't have to give an argument for it. And I verify that through sensory information, right? Um, the burner on my stove is hot. I know that by putting my hand over the burner and it recoils. I pull it away because it's hot, right? I don't have to make an argument for that. Okay, so it's not impossible. That says nothing really. It's not even very interesting from a historical perspective. It's not impossible, for example, that Thomas Jefferson had an affair with his oldest daughter, Martha. Fawn Brodie hints at that. She ingeminates that that's a possibility in her book when she looks at a letter where Jefferson's talking about longing to be home with his daughters, with Martha especially, and Brodie turns that into Jefferson longing sexually. Is that consistent with the letter? Of course it's consistent with, but that doesn't mean anything. A father can long to be with his daughters without wanting to have sex with them, right? And to turn it into that is just sort of malicious, right? Scandalous. So why does Monticello keep pushing this narrative of the fact of Jefferson's involvement with Hemings when all we can reasonably say is we just don't know, right? I can answer that question by posing another question. Why have people taken so eagerly and enjoyably to the transparently false 1619 thesis that says that the American country was really founded not in 1776 with the drafting of the Declaration of Independence and the formal Declaration of Independence prior to it, but in 1619 when the first ship of black slaves arrived to the colonies. Now, this is a transparently ridiculous argument, but yet the people at New York Times Magazine made a boatload of money by throwing this thesis out. And I think the author of the proposal won a Pulitzer or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. It's really a ridiculous claim. All you can say is if what Monticello's been doing is pushing the race card. And I've addressed this in several of my books and in papers and so forth, where I give prime examples and references to footnotes of what I call racistism. Racistism is using race to promote a political agenda, right? What they think they're doing is giving us a curative to American social ills, namely America's racism. And racism is predominantly said to be only something that white males especially practice. Okay, so to solve this problem, we build up Sally Hemings as a key early American figure and drop Jefferson down because he seduced his young, comely slave, probably maybe even raped her. So we bring Jefferson down the size, as Annette Gordon says, and we elevate Sally Hemings and make her out to be an important early American female figure, right? So Sally Hemings is beautiful. She's genteel. She's has a tremendous influence on Thomas Jefferson. And we might even say, according to the story, that her high intelligence probably influenced Jefferson on so many of key important decisions to which he came after he met Hemings in 1780, was it 6, when she was in Paris. I think all that is baloney. It's garbage. What we do know of Sally Hemings, she was very attractive as a young lady. Other than that, we know nothing about her. We have no reason to think that she was literate. So all things considered, the fact that Monticello doesn't address the issue, we need to accuse them of deliberately lying. Why do I say that? Because the arguments pro paternity are so transparently uncogent, so transparently weak. They know they're weak, right? You have to be a fool not to know they're weak, and yet they push them. And what they do is they disallow any engagement with anybody who disagrees with them. That is un-American. That is ungenerous. That is not liberal. So if they think they're pushing forth a liberal agenda, it's not. Okay, how do they get away with the lying? Two things, as I said in my title: propaganda and fear. I'm writing on a large book, 800-page book on the history of Ukraine. And when you look at Russia, especially as it morphs into the Bolshevik Revolution and into the USSR, the communists of Russia, Lenin, most especially Stalin paid lip service to establishing what we call the dictatorship of the temporary dictatorship of the proletariat, to free the masses from the horrors of Western capitalism. Right. What we got instead is no liberation from the horrors of free market capitalism, but we got the establishment of a bureaucratically dense and heavy and cumbersome totalitarian government where the Soviet vozhd, the Russian term for big boss, and that was Stalin, the person at the top, runs the show. Right? Anyone who disagrees with Stalin about anything, anyone who even looks like he might disagree, runs the risk of being exiled or eliminated or killed. Right? They had a cute phrase for that. When someone was executed, they said exile without possibility of intercourse through mail. You're going to be exiled, but you can't communicate with your family or friends, which means you're going to be killed. Stalin at one point even famously said that if there's an enemy out there of the state, if you have to kill, say, 10 people, innocent people, to assure yourself of killing the guilty party, that's no great loss. The main thing is to get rid of the guilty person. Stalin had a very liberal and willowy notion of what guilty meant, right? Anyone who disagreed with him was guilty. So it's no crime to kill people that way, as long as you're eliminating the guilty person, you know. Okay. And we know in his great purges in the late 1930s, Stalin killed thousands and thousands of important Soviet people, right? Generals and political people part of the KGB at the time, which what was a tantamount to the KGB at the time. He wanted to rewrite history, in effect, to show that, you know, the most important player in the Russian Revolution was Joseph Stalin, not Lenin, and especially not Trotsky, right? So he had this great political purge late in the 1930s where he eliminated just thousands of significant people. This played havoc with Russia's involvement in World War II because most of the great Russian generals were killed. So he had to have green, young, new generals directing military affairs, and the result was not promising. Now, I talk about propaganda and fear. That's what the Soviets used, and that's what Putin still uses. Point one, propaganda works. Putin knows that. What he does is he takes control of all of Russia's media, which is no small task. And of course, you can't do that. So what you do is that any leaks that occur, you convince through exposure, your own face on the media, that anything you might hear that runs contrary to the official Russian position is just Western garbage, nonsense that they're throwing out to convince you that the Russian political system is bad, right? So you have control of the media. And that's exactly what Monticello's done. They have control of Monticello and the thousands of people that come there each year and hear the story of Jefferson's racism and his hypocrisy. They have a very, very good webpage other than their crap on Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. It's a very important resource, and scholars, I use it at times, but scholars, when they come to Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings, don't get an honest assessment of what's going on in the issue of Jefferson's paternity. Right? They push the notion of Sally Hemings as a great historical figure. They push that on their website. They've changed the historical landscape, in conjunction with Peter Onuf, Dan Jordan, and Leslie Green Bowman. Almost everybody universally at UVA, thanks to Onuf, hates Thomas Jefferson. Everybody in Charlottesville detests Thomas Jefferson. They have control over that. And you can't, anytime you type in Thomas Jefferson, you're going to get an account like that, right? You have to talk about Jefferson's hypocrisy and his racism, right? They have control of UVA Press. Peter Onuf, Annette Gordon-Reed, Andrew Shaughnessy are the three main editors of Jeffersonian America, which tells you why none of my books on Jefferson have ever been published. And I've published 28 books, right? They won't allow anything of mine to be published, even though most of my books are on philosophical matters concerning Jefferson's political philosophy, his moral sense thinking, his aesthetic sense, Jefferson as architect, and things like that. Because I've written them, they won't allow them to be published. So they have complete control over the Smith Center, over UVA Press, Monticello. They have control. There's been contagion of their enormity, as it were, in Charlottesville and at UVA. So Jefferson is universally hated. Propaganda works. They have control of the media. Fear works. Putin knew that. Putin knows that. I mean, Stalin knew that. Putin knows that, right? It's funny when you look at, I don't mean funny in the literal sense, is that people who disagree with Putin publicly wind up sometimes being poisoned and dying from being poisoned, or being poisoned and not dying, as one Ukrainian president suffered from poisoning. People always tend often, I should say, when they disagree with Putin, to somehow fall out of the window to their death. How many people have fallen out of windows in the last 10, 12 years is astonishing. You know, it's a very common thing in Russia, apparently. Now, that means that the Russian people are just accept the lying, or they come to some sort of way of dealing with the lying by just thinking, okay, well, they're probably telling the truth, or who cares? They're not coming after me. I really don't care as long as I'm safe, right? The people at Monticello and the people who have partnered with Monticello use the same fear. And I point specifically to Annette Gordon-Reed, the Black historian who's written 3 books on Jefferson and Hemings. She has pushed the narrative in her first book, 1997, that all scholars who have dealt with Jefferson's possible paternity reject the notion of the possibility of paternity, mainly because they're white male scholars and they're racists. At least that's implicit in her argument, you know. And she has never backtracked on that. So the problem is that anybody like myself who wants to push them and argue that Jefferson did not have an affair with Sally Hemings runs fear of being called a racist. And I've been called a racist. Henry Winsack, for example, said that about me. If I wasn't a racist, I was very close to being one, he said, just because I don't buy into the Hemings Jefferson liaison, if you want to call it that, right? So she uses racism as a tool, and it's a very powerful tool. Be called a racist can do a lot to damage a scholar's career. If you don't agree with her, you're a racist. I conclude by saying that the good folks at Monticello, and I use the term good folks, tongue-in-cheek, of course, they have the bread, right? They have the Benjamins, they have the money. They can use propaganda effectively. They can use fear effectively when you have money. They can block people like me by not letting my books get published at UVA, not letting my voice get heard. It's a very, very, very dangerous situation. It's not the sort of liberalism that Jefferson championed, not the sort of liberalism that John Stuart Mill gives us in his Rules on Liberty. All voices need to be heard, right? And the truth will decide among them. They don't do that at Monticello. They continue not to do that. This is fascism. There's nothing else to say. It's fascism, right? They control the discourse on Jefferson by controlling the people at Monticello and around Monticello. They've been doing that for over 2 decades. They pushed the myth of Sally Hemings' beauty, gentility, and intelligence. They pushed the myth of Sally Hemings' political sway. At times, they pushed this political sway, or likely political sway, over Jefferson and his decision making. The reality of this is that Sally Hemings very likely was simply an unlettered, uneducated slave who was a very important figure in the Monticello household, as were all the Hemings children, but she was no more important than any other Hemings figure. And I argue clearly less important to Thomas Jefferson than brothers John, James, and so forth, who had more intimate workings with Thomas Jefferson. So let me end by, again, contact the people at Monticello, Jane Kaminsky especially, and ask for open discussion. Why is there still closed discussion on this? The issue has not been settled. We can't just assume it's been settled because they say it's been settled. It's an unhealthy state for American historians, especially Jeffersonian scholars. Again, we need to act on this. This is fascism, not liberalism. We need open discussion on issues. Open the door, and we need to appeal to the people at Monticello, Jane Kaminsky, the president, once again, to open the door as the door had been opened prior to the 2000 committee report from Monticello that inculpated Thomas Jefferson in paternity of Sally Hemings. That's all I have to say for now. Hope you enjoyed this. We'll return to this and other issues like that relating to Jefferson's paternity and Sally Hemings and the evidence pro and con in the future episodes. But for now, ta-ta. Ta-ta for now, TTFN. We'll do it again. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. And please like the video and share it if you would.